Alright, so we're gonna keep moving on with this refrigerator and sealed system troubleshooting. But before I get too deep into the actual refrigerator here, I wanna talk about something. Let's say I have a container, of Freon, and I have another container over here, and I have a pump that we have some gauges here, and we're taking the Freon from here in the pump's pumping it into this tank here. Okay? And this is so you understand what's going on in a refrigeration system. If I had this much Freon inside this container here, and let's say there's no Freon in here right now, what would the pressures be the same on both sides?
No.
So what would the pressure be on the left-hand side?
The pressure of the refrigerant
Okay, so
plus atmosphere.
let's say this is R134A, and the room temperature is 77 degrees.
So 55 pounds.
No, it's pretty close temperature pressure relation, so it's almost 70 psi.
Oh,
Okay, so 134A, even though the tank is not completely full, if that tank was filled up this high or filled up this high, temperature and pressure, 134A is a constant. The gas is maintaining that pressure and that temperature, okay? If I change the temperature that the refrigerant is at, the pressure would change on the unit. What would the pressure be on this tank here,
On the empty one?
on the empty tank? Zero. There's no pressure. Now, we said it's an empty tank, but is it really empty? No, it has air in it.
There's air pressure.
And when we're saying 0 psi and we're relating it to the gauge, the pressure inside this tank is the same as the pressure outside the tank. So the gauge does not read any difference in pressure when it says 0 psi. Okay? That when I pull a vacuum on the tank and the gauge starts going, like here's your low side gauge and you got 0, and this is 10 psi, 20 psi, etc. And then here you got 10 inches vacuum, 20 inches vacuum, and then 30, which is like the perfect vacuum there. That when we start pulling into a vacuum, that means the pressure inside that tank is less than the pressure outside the tank. That's why it shows what we call a vacuum. Okay? Now, let's talk about if I took this pump and started pumping the Freon into this tank, what's going to happen?
The pressure will change,
Okay, so the pressure on this side is going to do what?
decrease.
So the pressure is going to go down, and I'm leading up to something. You're all trying to say, well, why am I talking about this? And the pressure here is going to start to rise, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if I raise pressure, what happens to the temperature of the refrigerant?
It goes up as well.
It gets warm. It increases pressure, increases temperature. Refrigerant has a constant, has a change. So I start pumping the Freon into this tank. What happens when all the Freon from here is gone, but the Freon now is over here? What happens to the pressure here?
It goes to 0.
It goes to 0, and then eventually what will happen?
It'll drop into vacuum.
It'll pull into a vacuum because now you're taking anything out. Remember, at 0 psi, the tank still has Freon in it, mostly in a vapor form, and not enough to show pressure higher than the pressure outside the tank. Okay, the volume is so little in this tank. So what happens here? As I'm pumping the Freon, the pressure in the tank starts to go up because of the pump. Okay? So the Freon may have been at 77 degrees, let's just say 75 psi, sitting still, But as the pump's pumping it into the tank, because of the pump pumping it, it's increasing its pressure, so the pressure's going up and the temperature's going up. But what happens when there's no more refrigerant here to pump over to that side?
Pulls a vacuum.
It pulls a vacuum here, but what happens to the pressure here?
It has to stabilize.
It'll stabilize. Will it maintain, let's say it pumped into this tank at about 100 psi.
Mm-hmm.
Will it maintain that 100 psi?
No, it'll drop as it cools down.
As it cools down, it drops, and what will it change to?
Ambient temperature.
Back to that 75 psi. Even though the pump's still running. Why? Why does it drop even though the pump is still running? Because we said the pump is increasing its pressure, right?
The pump's heating up the Freon.
The pump is increasing the
Yeah.
pressure, which is causing a temperature pressure rise. But once it gets to the tank and fills up that tank, it drops its pressure back. This is important because I'm leading up to something within the refrigeration system and things that I want you to realize when it's running. Because can the Freon escape from this tank as I'm pumping into it?
No.
No. So it's being similar to what?
A sealed system?
But what type of sealed system problem?
A restriction.
A restriction. Where the volume of refrigerant on this side is no more. All the Freon on this side is gone. All the Freon on this side is here. It's going to raise in pressure when you first turn it on. But then once it doesn't continue to pump onto that side of the system, there's no more heat being produced. And this is important because I always tell you guys when you're doing sealed system jobs, feel the condenser. How's the condenser feel? Remember I had you guys last week. Put your hand on the condenser, feel the condenser, feel the heat. Because if the condenser's hot, that means the evaporator's cold. Well, when you have a restriction, compressor's going to pump all the Freon from the low side, the evaporator, and pump it into the condenser. So when you first turn it on, you'll feel the condenser and it'll start to get warm. But what happens if there's a restriction and now it took all the Freon out of the low side and pumped it into the high side? What happens to my condenser? The condenser gets cold again.
No more work can be done, no more heat can be extruded.
There's no more heat being produced because all the refrigerant was moved over here. We're not moving any more refrigerant. We have a restriction. So you'll feel the compressor run and you'll feel the condenser be room temperature because there's no more pumping into it. Okay? If I felt heat constantly being applied, not a lot, constantly being applied, and my low side is in a vacuum, what do you think is happening? And in other words, I feel the condenser a little warm, but not what it should be. What did we say it should be when it was running? Let's go back to that right over here. We said the condenser should be about 125 to 150 psi when it's running. That's how much pressure is normal on a condenser when a refrigerator runs. And if we went to the temperature pressure chart, I think we said it was about 110 degrees. So in a normal system, that condenser, and we'll turn the refrigerator around and take a look at it. In a normal refrigeration system, if we felt this condenser, the condenser should be about 110 degrees, which is a noticeable difference from the room. But what if I felt it get hot when I first turned it on, but then that heat went away?
You have a restriction.
I have a
You
restriction.
ran out of refrigerant to pump.
Now, will a low charge cause that? If I'm low on Freon,
It shouldn't, because it'll still be moving.
but what will happen if I'm low on Freon? Instead of a complete restriction is, let me go back to my drawing here. Here's your compressor. It's pumping out of the discharge here into the condenser. I'm just gonna abbreviate. Condenser, cap tube, evaporator, and then suction. So the Freon's flowing this way. It's going around this way.
Okay.
I'm low on Freon, or a restriction. A restriction, 99% of the time, is going to be somewhere in the cap tube. Why? Because the diameter of that tube is so small. It's this little tube right here. It's so small. Look at the outside. The inside's even smaller. And a Freon can't flow through it. Either some oil from the compressor got in there, or moisture. Now, from the factory, there shouldn't be any moisture. The only time you're going to have moisture contaminating your system is two things. Someone before you worked on it, it didn't properly evacuate it, didn't change the dryer filter, but they got this moisture appearing. Pause it. I gotta get my train of thought back into what I'm saying, but a restriction, moisture in your system is usually because somebody worked on it and didn't do a good job. Or the evaporator itself inside the box has a small hole. And when the unit runs normally, we said normal operation, the evaporator is about 0 psi. Normally when it's running. But if we have a small hole in the evaporator, real small, Freon leaks out, what happens to that pressure?
It doesn't build it, you lose it.
We don't have pressure anymore. We are in a vacuum. Now we got to use those terms. Pressure is above 0. Below 0 is a vacuum. Okay? So if I have a small pinhole right here, some Freon will leak out when the compressor's off, but when it turns back on, it can suck in moisture. Especially like if the timer went into defrost, turned on heat and started melting the ice off the tubing like it's supposed to, created all this steam and heat in there. Then the compressor comes on and sucks moisture in. So moisture is not going to be from the factory. Moisture is going to be an evaporator problem, or someone worked on it and didn't do the job properly. Okay? But oil from the compressor always flows around the system, a very little bit of oil in vapor form. That's normal. Okay? But if your condenser's dirty or the fan's not working, raises the temperature because we're not getting the heat. Now the compressor is working harder because if I raise the temperature, what happens to my pressure? It goes up. Temperature and pressure go together. So if the fan's not cooling it down or the coils are dirty, I raise the pressure. Compressor has to work harder. Now some more oil gets through than it's supposed to. Now we're going to get oil in our capillary tube and we're going to cause an oil restriction. Our dryer filter is there to protect the capillary tube. Its purpose, this dryer filter right here, is always connected to the entrance of the capillary tube. It's supposed to capture any debris from getting into the capillary tube. But its purpose is moisture related, not oil related. It has the same little bulbs that you damper it. You know, up north they put it in the closet to capture moisture so you don't get mold in the closets and stuff. But that's not meant to really capture oil. It'll capture oil, but if it's saturated with oil, it's not doing anything because it's going to get through and it's going to block up your capillary tube. So let's go back to that pressure thing. So when you first turn it on, you're going to feel it get warm, but that heat's going to go away in a restriction. If you're low on Freon, it's going to get hot, but it's going to start to go away. But there's a difference. A restriction, we pump it all into the other tank, it doesn't move from there. That's it, it's done. But low on Freon, we're still pumping, but we're not pumping the same amount of refrigerant, the same volume of refrigerant. So there will be a change in pressures, and there will be some temperature or heat created here, okay, but not as much. So what we did is from last week, we realized this refrigerator was running and it wasn't cooling properly. So I had the guys charge it, but I said, don't fill it up to the full amount of charge. Undercharge it to simulate like as if it had a leak and it was low on Freon. Now, when I'm done, I'll have you guys come feel it. Now, one of the things you want to look for do I have Freon, is the compressor pumping, is that if I have gas in there and the gas is always flowing, like it's low on Freon, the discharge line here is still going to be warm. This one is warm, hot, 100 degrees, I would say almost. And when I feel the condenser, where the Freon comes into the condenser, which is right about here, I can feel these loops closest to the fan. I gotta be careful I don't hit the fan blade. These loops here are warm. But as I go this way, the loops start to get cold. And when I get to these loops here, these loops are as cold as the room. So if I got it warm here, but not here, what is that telling me where I have heat on a few loops, but not all the loops? What is that telling me?
Refrigerant is making it.
The refrigerant is making it.
But I don't know. You losing it.
No. What's happening when there's heat? What's happening inside the condenser? What is it doing to the refrigerant?
It's cool.
It's cooling it, but what is happening to the refrigerant itself?
It's not flowing.
Oh, the phase change? Is that where you're going?
The what?
When it changes phases and expands? Is that what the direction you're going?
Well, actually, it's not expanding. This is called what? What is this
it
piece?
condenses.
It's condensing.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are turning refrigerant coming in the compressor and going out the compressor, it's vapor. Coming in the compressor is low pressure vapor. Coming out the compressor is high pressure vapor, high temperature. The purpose here is to release the heat from the condenser, and that releasing of heat is converting it from a vapor to a liquid. If you don't feel any more heat transfer, it has completely changed from a vapor to a liquid. Now, let me bring up a picture here real quick. Here. Didn't I type? Am I typing?
Yeah.
Let me get some images of a condenser. Let's just take a look at this one. Not exactly the same, but it's not perfect, but as Freon comes into the condenser, it's high pressure, high temperature vapor. Condenser means to condense, to pack it together. So as we release heat and it flows through here, it's condensing. It's turning to what?
Liquid.
To liquid. Very good. So coming out of the condenser, it's 100% what?
Liquid.
Liquid. So as we are changing from vapor to liquid, that is the heat we're feeling. The heat is telling us that the refrigerant is changing. It's doing its job. Okay? So we are getting heat. But if I get heat only this far, and there's no more heat down here, well, everything past that now means the refrigerant is in liquid form. Because vapor and liquid, just think about this for a minute. If I put water in a pot on a stove, the water in the pot is a liquid. When I turn the stove on, I'm adding heat. That liquid boils and turns to steam. So I'm converting it from a liquid to a vapor. I'm adding heat, creating that vapor. Well, if I want that vapor to be liquid again, I added heat to turn it to vapor. What do I got to do to make it liquid? I need to take the heat out. So that's what we're feeling in the condenser, is taking the heat out to change it back to a liquid. But if I only feel the heat in the first couple of loops, it's already removed all the heat and there's not enough refrigerant to create liquid. It's liquid now. It may not be full. In other words, the condenser should be releasing heat. About 90% of that condenser should be warm. That change from liquid to vapor is happening from the very beginning to the end. Okay, if I don't feel a full condenser warm, I don't have enough refrigerant. I'm either low on Freon or maybe a partial restriction, but that is not very common. Usually once you have a restriction, by the time the customer calls you, it's completely restricted. Okay, so I'm low on Freon. I leaked out, or the guy before you serviced it didn't charge it properly, who knows? But we want to feel the heat, and so I want to feel the discharge line. Is it hot? Yes, it's hot. First couple of lines are warm, but as we go over here, these lines are cold. So there is no more transformation from a vapor to a liquid. I don't have enough refrigerant. Just by feeling the coils. Let's take a look at the evaporator. So, the evaporator is just like its name. What does it mean when it's evaporating? We are changing what to what?
Changing the
Liquid to a
liquid
vapor.
to gas.
Changing a liquid to a vapor. So before we were changing a vapor to a liquid by releasing the heat. So what do we got to do in the freezer?
Add.
We got to add heat.
Take away the heat.
No, we add heat to the refrigerant. Okay? So in the freezer, look at our evaporator. Compressor's still running right now, even though I took the fan out. What do you see on the evaporator? Christmas.
Ice.
Snow. But only a few loops. Because
doing nothing.
once I reached here, because it came in the capillary tube, it came in and flowed here, started going this way. And once it got here, there's no more ice being produced. When you see ice on the evaporator, just like you feel the heat on the condenser, ice on the evaporator is telling you what?
It's
That's
doing its
working
job.
right.
That what?
It's doing its job. It's evaporating.
It is showing you the process of refrigerant coming a liquid to an evaporator. I'm sorry, liquid to vapor and to an evaporator. In the evaporator, it's changing from liquid to vapor. And the end result, like heat on the condenser, is frost on the evaporator because the pressure is 15 degrees below zero. So we're looking for the frost pattern, and everybody tells you look for the frost to see if the evaporator is full of Freon. If the evaporator was full, I would see a frost pattern on how much of the evaporator.
Oh.
Almost the whole evaporator.
90% of that.
When we come out the other line, which is back here, it's a little hard for you guys to see, which is the suction line, should be very little or no frost at that point because the evaporator should have totally changed it to vapor by the time it left that point, because right from there, it goes back to the compressor.
Can't that look like a free restriction though?
What?
Could that look like a restriction?
It could look like a restriction too.
So it could look like either a restriction or
Okay, but this is I'm going to get to. Well, how do you know if it's a restriction? Or how do you know if I'm just low on Freon? I mean, it's one or the other, right? Because a restriction will look very similar. The condenser will get hot, and then it'll lose its heat, and the evaporator is only going to have partial frost pattern. So what if we just took and put a valve on our system on the low side? What's it going to show me? Show me.
On the low side,
On the low side.
a couple PSI, a handful, 5, 6, 7, something
No.
like that.
No.
vacuums?
Vacuum. We go back to here, and normal low side pressure, it's on a process stub, is the same as a suction. The process and the suction are almost interchangeable, okay? As far as how they're connected to the compressor, they're the same thing. So when I put a valve here, it's the same thing and put it on the suction line. Normally when it runs, it's about 0 PSI with 134A. Maybe 1 at the most. 0 PSI. Now we cannot check the pressure with the evaporator and fan off. We have to have the evaporator covered and the fan running and a condenser with the fan running. We need to have everything running properly. If I take the cover off, my pressures won't be right. I'm not pulling heat across the coil. Okay? So I have to check it with this panel installed on the machine. But when I check the pressure, normally it's 0. But if I'm on a restriction or a leak, the pressure here is going to drop lower than 0. And what did we say is lower than 0?
Vacuum.
We're in a vacuum when we start going lower than 0. Okay? So you put your gauge on, and we use the low side of our gauge here. We put this to the process tube or the compressor, and it's going to show a vacuum. Can you connect this to the low side and turn it around for a second? So right now my gauges show 0. Why? Because the pressure on my gauge is the same as the pressure out here. So I'm going to have him connect this to the low side. Okay, now I know the fan cover's not on, but he's on the process stub of the compressor down there, and I'm almost 10 inches in a vacuum. Can you guys see that? I can't walk around the room, but if you can see, it's almost at 10 below 0 there. All right, I'll leave it laying here so you guys can come up and look at it. So that means my needle is right about here, 10 inches in the vacuum. So okay, well, it could be a restriction or it could be a low on Freon. Well, if I'm low on Freon, if you were putting a compressor in and you charged it up and you said, oh, I'm a little bit low, what would you do?
You could add Freon.
We'd add Freon, and if we added Freon when we're low, what would happen to our pressure?
It'll change.
Raise to 0. Well,
It-
ideally you would want it 0.
And raise back up towards 0, right? But what happens in a restriction, like we talked about here in this image, a restriction, and I add a little bit of Freon into this tank while the pump's running. And remember, this was the restriction. It went to here, it can't go no more. I'm in a vacuum here. I add a little bit of Freon, pressure here is going to go up till what happens?
And then it goes to those
Till the pump sucks it over here, and then what's going to happen?
vacuum.
It's going to go back into a vacuum. So if I went to this unit and my capillary tube's restricted, I add some Freon,
It's going to go back to the same
and it's going to raise the pressure up for a minute, and then once the compressor sucks the Freon and pumps it to the condenser, and it's restricted, it can't move, I go back into a vacuum. Now if you do it too many times,
You get overdose, huh?
you put way too much refrigerant in here, and then your pump, which is your compressor, starts to make noise, starts to strain, because you're trying to get it to pump against the condenser, and it can't pump no more. You're straining the compressor, and a lot of times you hear that compressor run. I've seen people install a compressor, and this line right here, the discharge line where they brazed it, they restricted that point right there. So the compressor, let's just say I put a restriction right here. So now I'm sucking the Freon out of here, and that's as far as the pump can go. That's really bad, because now you're trying to pump against a piece of pipe only this long. You're trying to put volumes of refrigerant in there, and you're going to damage the valves, damage the compressor.
Damage the valves in
In the pump,
Oh.
in the compressor.
In the compressor.
Because it's pumping and that discharge line is restricted, it can't go to the condenser. But if I'm low or leak, and this is able to return back to here, I can raise the pressure up and it'll maintain 0 PSI. So if you go to a unit and you're in a vacuum like this, and you're like, well, it could be a restriction or it could be a leak. How do I know? Well, we need to put gauges on it to see what the reading is, right? Then we connect the Freon and we add a little bit of Freon. and just see if we can get, we don't have to go all the way to 0 right away. We can add a little bit of Freon, let it equalize a little bit. Now if it pulls right back down to the vacuum you had when you started, you add a little more, it pulls right back down to the vacuum where you started, what's that mean? It's a restriction. Because I can't get that low side. I add some Freon that goes up, and then it goes right back down. I add some Freon that goes up, and then it pulls back down. Well, it's pumping right to here, and it's stuck. I got a restriction. Now, well, how do you know what a restriction is? I did a video on how to check a capillary tube restriction. It's on YouTube. You guys can check that out. But here, if I can raise the pressure and it goes to 0 and stays at 0, what's the first thing I want to do at that point?
Add more Freon.
No, I add it to 0. Then what do I want to
You
do?
want to feel the condenser.
I want to feel the condenser. Why? Because the whole condenser should be warm. So I'm going to check here. And here, the shawl should be about the same temperature. And if that's so, then I got to look for what? A leak. Now the bad thing is if you come behind another technician and they had a leak, like they put a new compressor in, one of their braze joints leaked, it's hard to tell when the unit's running to look for a leak. Why? Wait, why is it hard to tell where the leak is if another technician before you serviced it, you added Freon, now the pressures are normal? Why is it hard to tell the leak?
Because it's still flowing, it's just not leaking fast enough for you to know.
Yeah, but the evaporator is 0 psi, and this one that says 125 psi, when the compressor is running, if the leak's on my low side, it's at 0 psi. When it's leaking, it's such a minute leak, your gauges might not register it.
And you won't be able to hear it.
So what we need to do at that point is we need to recover the refrigerant from the system and put nitrogen in there, not with the compressor running. We take a nitrogen tank and we put 100 psi, oops, yeah, I was SPI, I can't even write. We do 100 psi of nitrogen, and the compressor is not running at this time. We don't run the compressor with nitrogen, but we fill it all the way up with 100 psi. So it'd be like this. Both tanks are 100 psi. The pump's not running, but now the whole system's at 100. So now if I get a leak on the low side, the pressure's at 100. It's going to show better than if we did a compressor running at 0. So that's why we use nitrogen when we work on a system. We charge it with nitrogen and we look for the leak there with salt. What's one evidence of a leak in a system? What would we visually look for if the system had a leak and it's been running for a little while?
Oil?
Oil. Usually with refrigerant, oil flows through.
You can smell it.
Yeah, but they ain't gonna tell you where it's at. So usually you might find evidence of oil at one of the braze joints if they were leaking for any period of time. It's not always, but oil will help you locate the leak. So what was your question?
Well, that's my train of thought now.
So this unit was purposely done as a low charge because I want you guys to feel the condenser. I want you to look at the evaporator. I want you to look at what a low charge is, and then later today we'll charge the unit up with Freon, and then I want you guys to look at the evaporator with Freon and feel the condenser when it's properly charged, running at proper pressures. Yes, sir.
If you don't have nitrogen, how would you check that? Let's say you're.
That's what you're supposed to have.
Okay.
They sell small tanks like this, same as your brazing tanks, with a nitrogen regulator on it. You gotta be careful with nitrogen because the tank itself is about 3,000 to 3,500 psi all the time until it gets low. So 3,000 psi is very dangerous. So you have to charge it with nitrogen to do that. You can't charge it with Freon and look for a leak. Yeah, if I did put Freon in there, I could charge it to about 70 psi without the compressor running. But then I have to recover that Freon. I'm not allowed to let that out in the air. Where nitrogen, we can charge, and something called dry nitrogen. Dry nitrogen has no moisture in it. And when we're done, we're allowed to blow that nitrogen out into the air, and then we can pull the vacuum and charge it up. So this is an example of low charge. You guys got any questions?
So what if they did a UV dryer filter? You could also check for the leak like that
And then how do you check for that?
with the glasses and the UV light.
Don't necessarily need the glasses. If you
Yeah.
just have a black light, UV, that dye is usually like a green fluorescent color. And if it leaked, you would notice anywhere around these braze joints that's where the leak was, and you could find it by that. The bad thing about UV is once you get that in your gauges and everything turns that color. And then you use your recovery machine, you recover that UV refrigerant. So it does contaminate, doesn't damage. Contaminate means it just gets all over everything. So next time you go to work on a refrigerator and you use those same gauges, some of that UV's in your gauges, and now you go into another refrigerator and now you got this green dye all over the valve itself where you connected your Freon. So next time you come back to that refrigerator, you're looking at the dryer and say, damn, I got a leak from that valve. No, that was because you connected hoses that had some of that dye in it, now it got on that valve.